It was beneath this unassuming car park in the summer of 2012 in the heart of the city of Leicester that one of the most important historical discoveries of the last 500 years was made. Right here, in a long forgotten grave, was found the scarred and broken skeleton of a long dead man, none other than Richard III, King of England. But what exactly happened to him? How did he end up buried beneath a car park? And what can that remarkable discovery tell us about Shakespeare's infamous villain, the last English king to die in battle? In this video, using the latest technology, archaeological evidence and historic testimony, we'll uncover the true story of the final days of Richard III. By 1483, England was 30 years into an all-engulfing conflict known as the Wars of the Roses, fought between the major houses of York and Lancaster. In a real-life Game of Thrones, plotting, intrigue, marriage and murder all mingled to create a highly unstable climate, which by 1485 was presided over by the House of York, with the newly installed King Richard III at its head. So who exactly was Richard III? What do we know about him? Well, apart from the obvious ruthless streak, like having his own nephews killed to keep power for himself, for example, we do actually have a fair amount of information about him, much of which comes from examining his skeletal remains. From those, we learn that 32-year-old Richard stood around 5 foot 6 inches tall, slightly below average for the time, and he had a relatively slight frame. His diet was clearly quite meat-rich in his adult years, and some evidence exists that he suffered from the intestinal parasite roundworm. Perhaps the most famous depictions of Richard come from a playwright named William Shakespeare, who, writing during the Tudor period, famously called him a poisonous bunch-backed toad. But was he? Well, not really. His skeleton does in fact show that he suffered from moderate scoliosis, or curvature of the spine, which, whilst prominent as we see here, would have likely been unnoticeable whilst clothed or wearing armour. We also have the benefit of accurate facial reconstruction of seeing exactly what he looked like. So it was this somewhat unassuming face that belonged to a man who by 1483 sat, albeit rather tenuously, on the throne of England. But who was the man keeping him up at night? It was this guy, Henry Tudor. 4 years younger than Richard, he was the son of Lancastrian Edmund Tudor, half-brother of Henry VI, and Lady Margaret Beaufort, and therefore crucially held a claim, albeit a very weak one, on the English throne. Raised in exile in France, he had assumed his family's ancient title of the Earl of Richmond, and with the help of anti-Yorkists in Britain, developed something of a following amongst those who opposed Richard's rule. Italian diplomat Polydore Vergil, who chronicled much of the coming campaign, described Henry as follows. His body was slender, but well built and strong. His height above the average. His appearance was remarkably attractive and his face was cheerful, especially when speaking. His eyes were small and blue, his teeth were few, poor and blackish, his hair was thin and his complexion sallow. With the backing of one of Richard's former strongest supporters, the Duke of Buckingham, Henry had already tried to invade Britain once in 1485. That attempt, blighted by poor weather, had been a failure, resulting in little more than Henry returning to France and Buckingham being reduced in size by one head. But by July 1485, backed by French mercenaries and Scottish troops, and with the support of the French king, who was always happy to see England fighting internally, he was poised here at Harfleur and ready to roll the dice once again. On the 1st of August 1485, Henry Tudor, at the head of his small force of around 4,000 men, left Harfleur on a 7-day voyage which ultimately led him right here to Mill Bay in Pembrokeshire. Over the next fortnight, Henry began a march through this area, calling supporters to his colours as he advanced through relatively friendly territory. The crucial moment in that week, though, came when he met with a family whose support could quite literally decide the fate of a kingdom. Enter the Stanleys. Powerful family led by two brothers, Lord Thomas and Sir William. They almost could claim a kingdom of their own, holding huge sway in this area of Wales and northwest England. With the backing of perhaps 5,000 men at arms, they were also a formidable military player and could potentially tip the scales in any major fight. The question was, though, who did they support? On one hand, Lord Thomas was actually Henry Tudor's stepfather, having married Henry's mother after his father's death, and so had clear ties to the young pretender. But Thomas's younger brother William had fought for the Yorkists to great applause, been knighted for his services and carried the ceremonial constable's mace at Richard III's coronation. At this stage, on whose side the Stanley support would fall was far from certain. Whilst Henry advanced, Richard was not waiting idle. Having relocated here to the central city of Nottingham, he gathered a significant host, perhaps as many as 10,000 men, double Henry's force, and learning of his landing a week earlier, he moved to intercept. First travelling to the city of Leicester, then upon hearing of Henry's direction of march the following day, he moved to block him, marching out of the city at the head of his force, the scene depicted in this famous painting. It's very likely that en route to the battlefield, he crossed Bow Bridge just here, with local legend recounting that his spurs struck the stone parapet on the bridge as he passed. Witnessed by a local wise woman, she famously prophesied that his head would strike the same spot when next he returned. But for now, let's take a look at where they were heading. Ironically, if we were making this video 20 years ago, we'd be looking at a completely different spot right now, as until about 2007, the battle was believed to have occurred just here next to this high ground known as Ambion Hill. In fact, there's even a visitor centre to the battle here today. But recent archaeological studies, mapping of terrain features and consulting of primary sources actually suggested the battle site was several miles away right here. Those studies, along with metal detecting of the area, brought many items to light, including round shot fired from mobile artillery used for the first time in England during the battle. Also identified were items of horse tack, buckles, sword hilts, and most famously this white boar badge, worn only by Richard III's personal bodyguard in battle, finally confirming the true battle site to be right here. Historical records tell us that by the evening of the 21st of August, Richard's army was encamped just here, along the old Roman road known as Fen Lane, and close to the village of Sutton Cheney. Positioning his forces astride the road, he could move quickly to block Henry's progress towards London. Henry, on the other hand, was by nightfall on the 21st right here, about 6 miles away, in the vicinity of an old hamlet known as Sheepy Parva. Throughout that evening, aware of the proximity of the opposing force, both sides prepared for battle. Legend has it that Richard took mass right here in the church of St James in Sutton Cheney, which still looks much as it would have done some 500 years ago, whilst Henry, on the other hand, had a very much more mortal saviour in mind. He was in fact here a few miles away at Merivale Abbey, meeting with his father-in-law, Lord Thomas Stanley. What actually passed between the two men in that meeting is today subject to much speculation, but whatever was said, it's clear that the Stanleys would be present at the fight. But for now at least, on which side they would engage remained a mystery, especially because, as an insurance of sorts, Richard had taken Lord Thomas's son as a de facto hostage to ensure he made the right choice. By the early hours of the 22nd of August 1485, these fields were filled with around 15,000 men drawn up in battle formation. Let's take a look. The historical record and modern archaeological evidence tells us that Richard's forces were arrayed just here in 3 bodies of men, rather confusingly known as battles. In his vanguard, under the command of the Duke of Norfolk, were the bulk of his archers, dismounted men-at-arms and spearmen, between which were placed his artillery pieces. Behind that first line in the central battle, commanded by Richard himself, was a further body of dismounted men-at-arms and Richard's own personal household troops. Mounted and in full plate armour, the 200 or so knights would have been an imposing sight. Finally, in the third battle, commanded by the Earl of Northumberland, were a mixed reserve of mounted and dismounted troops. Drawing up just here about an hour later, some 800 yards away, was Henry Tudor's much smaller Lancastrian force. Also in 3 battles, Henry's vanguard of archers, French mercenary men-at-arms and his few guns was led by the experienced Earl of Oxford. Behind them, arrayed in ranks, were more men-at-arms and finally Henry himself. We actually know a fair amount about Henry's personal bodyguard at the battle. Exclusively mounted and like Richard in full plate armour, they were a group of Henry's closest advisors. Amongst them was Sir William Brandon, Henry's standard-bearer, and the massive jousting champion Sir John Chain. Believed to have stood 6 foot 8 inches tall, he was one of the country's most famed and formidable knights. Whilst both armies faced off just across this ground, all eyes turned as yet more banners were seen arriving on the field. Just here, off to Henry's right and Richard's left, were none other than the Stanleys. At the head of around 4,000 troops, they simply stood and waited for the action to unfold. I'd just like to pause for a moment here and thank you for watching so far. We at Battle Guide are a small team of historians and editors who just love to share history. Each and every video we make is from scratch, using primary sources, detailed research, historical imagery, and footage we gather by literally visiting each site. All this is made possible thanks to the support of our Patreons. By joining our dedicated community, not only can you help us to make more films like this, but you can also help decide which subjects we cover next and get access to a huge catalogue of virtual battlefield tours, available exclusively to our Patreons, ranging from Agincourt to Stalingrad. Your support, for the same price as a cup of coffee, makes a real difference. And if you'd like to know more about how you can support us via Patreon or through our brand new Battle Guide merchandise, be sure to check out the link in the description below. Thanks very much. So, back to the action. With first blood imminent, both sides prepare to advance. The ground upon which the fight would unfold, seen here, is much as it looked at the time, with one major exception. This area, described by historic sources as a marsh, though more likely actually an ancient floodplain, which in effect shielded Henry's right flank, would play a crucial role in the battle that was about to commence. Polydore Virgil recalled the opening scenes as Henry's leading battle advanced. When the king saw the enemies pass the marsh, he commanded his soldiers to make charge upon them. Suddenly, making great shouts, they assaulted them first with arrows, but they were not faint unto the fight, and began to shoot fiercely in reply. With the leading battle lines exchanging fire amidst a rolling gun smoke and hail of arrows that thumped into their respective opponents, Richard made his move. Sending his largest battle under the Duke of Norfolk away to the right, he aimed to smash into Henry's exposed left flank and roll up his force against the marsh. Seeing this, the Earl of Oxford moved to meet him. Despite being heavily outnumbered, when the two forces met right here with sword, halberd and spear, it was the experience of Oxford's professional mercenaries that tipped the scales. By maintaining close control and tight formation, he formed his troops into a wedge which carved through the Yorkist ranks, splitting Norfolk's force and either cutting them down or sending them in flight back to the main lines. Seeing his formation breaking apart, and in an attempt to rally his troops, Norfolk himself waded into the midst of the fight and was quickly struck down, either by an arrow to the face or perhaps by Lancastrian knight Sir John Savage. Dragged from the melee, he would die a short time later. The loss of one of Richard's most experienced commanders and his son, who was captured at the same time, seems to have had a disastrous effect on the morale of Richard's troops, who would see their numerically superior force bested before their eyes. There's still a little debate about what happened next, but it's likely that Richard signalled to Northumberland commanding his reserve to advance on Henry's still hard-pressed lines. Nothing happened. Either through treachery, or perhaps because his advance would take him in a perilous route between the marsh and the waiting Stanleys, the Earl of Northumberland did not advance, and instead watched on as the fight unfolded. But all was not lost. Through the smoke of battle, Henry himself was spotted, though some way to the rear of his main force, and with only a small bodyguard and a few pikemen around him. Seeing an opportunity to land a decisive blow and end the battle quickly, Richard decided to act. Polydore Virgil paints the scene. Whilst the battle continued hot on both sides betwixt the front lines, King Richard understood, first by espials, where Earl Henry was afar off with a small force of soldiers about him. Then, after drawing nearer, he knew it perfectly by evident signs and tokens that it was Henry. Wherefore, all inflamed with ire, he struck his horse with spurs and runneth against him from the other side beyond the battle line. King Henry perceived King Richard coming upon him, and because all his hope was then in valiancy of arms, he received with great courage. King Richard at the first brunt overthrew Henry's standard and killed William Brandon, the standard bearer, and matched with John Chain, a man of much fortitude, far exceeding the common sort, who encountered with him as he came. But the king, with great force, drove him to the ground, making way with weapons on every side. The historical record states that Richard's wild charge brought him to within a sword's reach of Henry before a fresh knot of men joined the fight, dragging Henry clear and dismounting him into the safety of a group of French pikemen. Now on this spot, exhausted knights on blown horses, edging ever closer to the marshy ground, and men-at-arms clubbed at each other with fast-fading strength. Then the Stanleys struck. Watching on from just here, and now clear that a decisive moment had been reached, Sir William Stanley at the head of a mounted force charged into the fight. But on which side? It soon became clear when the first Stanleyan slammed into the rear of Richard's tiring force, dragging men from their horses, hacking at dismounted knights and driving the remainder across the battlefield. All except Richard and a handful of men. Witnesses recount that his exhausted horse had strayed into the marshy ground and there became stuck, its rider unable to extricate himself. dismounted and surrounded by enemies, the moment immortalised by Shakespeare in one of the most famous lines in English literature, with the supposed cry, a horse, my kingdom for a horse," before being overwhelmed and cut down. But what do we know of the real end of King Richard III? The historical record differs quite significantly from Shakespeare's prose, offering an alternative perspective of a man certainly not short of personal bravery. Spanish historian Diego de Valera, who interviewed Juan de Salazar, an aide to Richard at the battle, recalled the king's response to his suggestion that he flee the field. "Salazar, God forbid I yield one step. This day I will die as a king or win." Virgil too spoke of Richard's final moments with praise. "In a moment the retinue all fled, and King Richard alone was killed fighting manfully in the thickest press of his enemies." As Shakespeare alludes to, it's likely that Richard at the point of death had been unhorsed and surrounded, though according to contemporary historian John Rouse, Richard's last words were not to call for a horse, but simply to shout, "Treason, treason, treason." The truth of those final moments will remain a mystery, but the cause of Richard's death has in recent years become far more clear. Again, Bosworth's unique in that we have a wealth of scientific evidence for how the main protagonist met his end. King Richard's skeleton is a catalogue of trauma received in the last minutes or seconds of his life. In total, he received 11 peri-mortem wounds about his face and head, chest and pelvis. These wounds tell a story. After being unhorsed, it's quite likely that he lost his helmet, or he was battered onto his knees and had it forcefully removed. Either way, we know that he was smashed and sliced about the head, probably with roundel daggers, although not so deeply and grievously that he would become unidentifiable. All would have bled profusely, but it wouldn't have been immediately fatal. The coup de grace, if there was one, came from a blow to the back of the head, almost certainly with Richard leaning forward without a helmet, with a billhook or halberd straight into the brain. Indeed, Molinet, the Burgundian chronicler, mentions a Welshman striking the king dead with a halberd. Once dead, we know that he was stripped of his armour and clothes and thrown over the back of a horse. This is all backed up by the osteology. He clearly suffered 2 humiliation wounds. One of those was a dagger stab to the back, grazing the inside of a rib. The other probably took place when he was draped over the back of a horse and he was unceremoniously stabbed in the rear, the blade cutting the inside of his pelvis. Thus ended the last Plantagenet king, stripped naked, hung over a horse, stabbed in the backside and paraded across Bow Bridge through jeering crowds into Leicester. His opponent, still on the Bosworth battlefield once Richard's last troops had fled, surveyed the ground where more than 1,000 Yorkists and several hundred of his own men lay dead. Local lore tells that right here, on this hill in the village of Stoke Golding, Richard's crown, found amongst the debris on the battlefield, was placed on Henry's head to the cheer of his troops by none other than Lord Stanley. In that moment, a new dynasty was born, the Tudors, who would hold the crown of England for the next 117 years. But what of the slain king? Much like the truth of his demise, the location of his burial eventually faded from memory, and sometime in the 17th century, amid the evolution of Britain's cities, was lost to the passage of time. But more than 500 years after his death, all that was to change. Historians and latterly researchers at the University of Leicester, in examining historical maps of the city, found documents detailing the position of the long-destroyed Greyfriars Friary, where Richard had reportedly been buried. By taking one of those maps and overlaying it onto the modern city of Leicester, we can identify the approximate location where it once stood. Contemporary sources state that after 3 days on public display, Richard's body had been unceremoniously buried in a hastily dug grave without a coffin at the west end of the church choir in Greyfriars. That location, when looking at the superimposed aerial over the modern satellite, is to be found right here, under what in 2012 was a section of local council car park. But of course at the time, its precise orientation and location remained something of a mystery. After detailed research and ground-penetrating radar surveys, an archaeological dig was commissioned, with trenches to be dug in these locations, with the stated objectives being 1. Locate the remains of the Franciscan friary, 2. Identify clues to the position and orientation of the buildings, 3. Locate the church within the friary, 4. Locate the choir within the church, and 5. Locate the remains of Richard within the choir. It was believed by the team that perhaps the first of these objectives might be met, but realistically nobody considered that the dig would meet all of them. Launched on the 25th of August 2012, the first of 3 trenches, a 1.6 by 30 metre section, was dug just here, and almost immediately found a human left leg bone, perhaps not hugely surprising in an old church. It was covered up, and the dig continued. Before long, evidence of a medieval wall belonging to the priory was found just here. Over the coming days, a second trench was completed in this area, which found further evidence of walls that allowed archaeologists to piece together the orientation of the priory as a whole, which we can overlay onto the modern satellite to identify a precise location. By further examining existing records, it soon became clear that by chance, the very first area of Trench 1 to be dug was in fact about the right location for the church and the associated choir. Further work to identify other walls in the vicinity corroborated that evidence, and before long focus had returned to those very first bones discovered on the opening day of the dig. Having successfully applied for a license to recover remains found in the excavation, the process of exhuming those in Trench 1 began. It wasn't long before a male skeleton, aged around 30, was identified in a simple and slightly too small grave. As the recovery continued, the distinct spinal curvature of scoliosis became apparent, as did clear signs of battlefield trauma to the skeleton. DNA comparison with a descendant of Richard's line sealed the deal, and 527 years after his death in battle, King Richard III had been found. After lying in this now preserved grave for 5 centuries, the final chapter in the story of Richard III took place when on the 23rd of March 2015, Richard's coffin, draped with his royal standard, was transported to Leicester Cathedral via the battlefield where he had lost his life, witnessed by thousands of people, myself included, before he was laid in state for 2 days and reinterred in a funeral service fit for a king. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, why not check out our other documentaries covering some of the most iconic battles in history right here on YouTube. And a final shout out to our dedicated Patreon community, whose support quite literally makes creating videos just like this possible. To find out how to join them, check out the link below. That's all this time. We'll see you again soon.